scripture for the message is in the letter of James, chapter 1, verses 19 through 27. Know this, my beloved brethren. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore put away all filthiness, rampant wickedness. Receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself, he goes away, and at once he forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, that person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. May God bless the reading of his word. The anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Strong statement, straightforward, but hard to remember and put into practice, as James seems to have a knack to give us these kind of statements that are concise and yet very hard to practice. I remember many years ago getting so mad at drivers. You could ask Tammy, and she'd say there's residue of this now, probably still, but back then it was worse. And they would, do something. There would be some kind of a trigger that would happen, and I remember just getting so mad I would literally be yelling at them, in the car. I mean, this could be in the dead of winter, and the windows are up, and yet I'm yelling. They can't hear me anyway, so don't know what good it was doing anybody, but seemingly me at the time. And then on some rare occasions, even almost wanting to take that anger out in how I driving in an angry way. And like I said, there was some trigger. They usually did something dumb or dangerous at the time, and yet who hasn't done that when they drive? Of course, probably at the time I thought I haven't, or at least not as dumb or dangerous as it was they just did to me. But either way, it was just something that wasn't very good, and the anger got triggered. It got expressed then, but it really didn't start then. It started more with a lot of various fears. My life was more busy and chaotic back then. Both Tammy and I were going to school and working full-time at the same time. And so we had a lot going on. And so it just seemed that those pent-up fears suddenly would come out if there was a good enough trigger to bring them out, and I would unleash that anger. And yet, as James said, the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Jesus is able to lead us to a different behavior. He implants something new within our souls. And that new thing is his very love. The love that he has that's greater than the fears that we have. And he's able, as James says, to implant that within our hearts. That's what our text is lifting up for us. As James again starts out very directly, let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, and so slow unto anger. Why? Because the anger of man does not have the ability to work the righteousness of God. Anger, he adds, leads to uncleanness and an abundance of wickedness. And it's only with meekness, which I think here means a kind of a steadfast persevering among all of the wrongs going on around us, whether it's other people or ourselves, persevering through that. So this strong kind of meekness Only with that can we receive the implanted word, he said. Now, how do we know that we've received this word? Well, he adds, when we become doers of the word, and not just hearers only. Some people think they're religious, but they're only deceiving themselves. James uses the image of someone looking into a mirror and then going away and forgetting what they even look like anymore, so they paid no attention to what they were seeing in the mirror before. And he applies that to someone who hears about what it is that we're supposed to do as Christians in religious behavior, but then we turn around and don't do that at all. We're hearers, but we're not doers. Just to think we're religious, or to think we're worshipful would be another translation of that word. But not bridling our tongue makes our religion empty, or in this translation, worthless. James gives, in contrast to that clean and pure religion with our Heavenly Father, is two things. Visit orphans and widows in their affliction, so not unleashing anger at people, but having acts of love come out of us for those who are most in need, and in that day and age it was orphans and widows. And then second, holding oneself spotless from the world. So instead of participating in the common acts of anger that people express and unleashing that, holding it, or holding back from that, and instead calling to Jesus and saying, we need your love to work through us, so that our anger is not what other people see. And why? Because the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Let's hear about a man named Don Hazell and an experience with a close friend of his named James Bowers. Both Don and James taught at Southeastern State University of Oklahoma. And James was also the men's basketball coach. One day, James came to Don's office and he put down a newspaper and said, "Did you see that?" It was a school newspaper with an article on the front that was demanding James's firing because the team was losing so badly. In fact, they were in 10th place in a 10-team conference. Now, Don, he was thinking to himself as he saw the article sitting there, and he wanted the team to win, and he knew James did too. And after all, he was a faculty athletic representative. But James, he said, was more important to him. He was my friend. We played golf together. We bowled on the same team. Our families did activities together. Don knew that James had been under a lot of pressure lately. At the last basketball game, James had exploded in fury over a ref's call. And that just wasn't like him to do that, Don said. So in answering James, he said, well, he consoled, the season's almost over anyway. Yes, James said, but I've already got the message. It's next year or else. Do you have any prospects? Well, there is a junior college player that I'm recruiting. He was an All-American this year. He could be the difference between last place and first place for our team. Well, a few months after that conversation, Don was glad that he saw that 6'8" Billy Collins was enrolled in his fall biology class. That being glad didn't last too long, as he found out that not only was Billy a poor student on learning slowly, but he also made no effort whatsoever in any way. He skipped class often, he flunked every test. Don even offered to tutor him privately, but he didn't care and didn't want that. James had warned Billy about grades. You have to keep them up in order to play, but it just didn't seem to matter to him. At the end of the semester, Don had a hard decision to make. He wanted a winning team as much as anybody else at the college, and he knew that if the team lost Billy from eligibility, that might cost James his job. but he wasn't even close to passing. He's flunking by a wide margin. So what is he going to do? He decided to flunk him, and Billy became ineligible for sports. A few days later, Don was walking outside, and James was coming the other way, and right as they got close, James turned his head off to the side. He tried to just shrug it off, Don did, and thought, well, maybe something he saw or something else. But a few days later, again, he's outside walking between classes, and here comes James, and this time he crosses the street and goes on the other side of the road so that he doesn't have to pass by Don very closely. This wasn't my imagination. James didn't want to see me. I was losing a friend. To make a long story short, they did have a losing record that year. James was fired as the coach. Now, James' wife wouldn't even talk to Don's wife at the grocery store. Tried to act like he wasn't there. Don had gone to a youth baseball game, and he saw one of James's sons there and said hi to him. And the son snapped back, "Don't speak to me, because I'm not about to talk to you." Don said he started to feel a bitterness inside him, in his heart. James still taught special education classes at the college, so it wasn't like he was unemployed. And Don was right to flunk Billy. So if James couldn't see that, it was his fault. If Don, thought if he doesn't decide to speak to me, well then fine, I won't speak to him either. Months passed by, and yet Don wasn't feeling very good about the things that were going on in this situation. He remembered kind of praying, a so-called prayer, "Lord, I don't understand it. I just did my job. I didn't do anything wrong. It's James' fault, so why should I feel bad?" Now, of course, he didn't receive any direct answer to that question because it was more of a complaint than a prayer. But 2 years later, the churches in the community got together to work on an evangelism event. And they had this counselor training sessions that were starting up. And James and his wife were from another denomination, but they came to these sessions. And Don and his wife were also there. Well, they sat on opposite sides of the room. At the last session, though, the leader asked for these counselors to come forward for prayer if there's any barrier that would hinder their effectiveness as a counselor. Don said, "Suddenly it struck me. All the bitterness and pain I felt over the past 2 years, it didn't come from James. Here I was supposed to be a follower of Christ who forgave sinners even before they asked him to. And yet I had been so convinced of my own righteousness that I'd waited over 2 years for James to make the first move. And letting so much ill feeling take over during that time, I poisoned my own spirit as well." So he offered a silent prayer there. "I'm sorry, Lord. Help me." And then Don got up and he started walking to the other side of the room, and he looked up and he saw that James was walking towards him. They caught each other's eyes. At first it was a pained and awkward look, but Don said miraculously, the look changed from pain to understanding, and from understanding to hope. They embraced, thanking God for bringing them back together again. "Life's too short for hating," James said. Well, soon their families were getting together again, and on one of those occasions, James' wife said to Don's wife, "It's great that we don't have to act like we're strangers anymore." And they both turned to their husbands and they asked kind of jokingly, "Whose fault was all of this anyway?" Don said that when he answered, it was a very serious answer. "That's the question we both decided to stop asking." Let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow unto anger. Why? Because the anger of man does not and cannot work the righteousness of God. Let's not be deceiving ourselves and being hearers only and not doers of the word. Jesus wants to implant something new within our soul, his own love, which is greater than all of our fears, no matter how strong. So not pent up fear and anger, but may Jesus' love shine through our hearts for all the people around us, no matter what they have done.